I let them believe I was losing my hearing. My children, Leo and Cynthia, would gather in my kitchen, their voices quiet, confident in their privacy. They didn't know that the sensitive microphones, which I had installed years ago as a professional hobby, transmitted their every word to my headphones. They greedily planned how to sell my property, my past, my life. And I just sat in the living room, pretending to read my newspaper. But I wasn't reading. I was listening. And the reel-to-reel tape recorder in my basement workshop silently and flawlessly recorded their conspiracy on tape. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My world grew quiet, not by the slow, inevitable theft of age, but by a deliberate and calculated choice. I am Walter Finch, 83 years old, and I spent 45 of those years in the service of sound. Not music, but the hidden symphony of the world that exists beneath the noise. I was a forensic audio engineer, a man who could coax a whispered confession from the roar of a jet engine on a corrupted tape, a man who could hear the subtle edit in a pause, the lie in a sound wave. My ears were my life's great instruments, and when their acuity began to fade, I did not surrender to the encroaching silence. I chose instead to master it. To my children and to the world, I became a profoundly deaf old man, a figure of sympathetic smiles and shouted conversations. But in the private, secret theater of my own home, I could hear everything. My house, a large, creaking Victorian that had been in my family for a century, was my final and most ambitious audio project. After my wife, Martha, passed, the silence she left behind was an unbearable, empty presence. It was a dead space, an absence of sound that I, a man of frequencies and amplitudes, could not tolerate. So, I did what I knew how to do. I gave the house a voice. Over the course of a winter, I wired it for sound, not with speakers, but with microphones. It was not an act of espionage, but an act of intimacy. I wanted to hear the house breathe. I installed tiny, sensitive condenser microphones, disguised as screwheads, in the crown molding of each room. I placed a contact microphone on the great groaning water pipe in the basement, transforming it into a resonant stethoscope that could pick up the vibrations of the entire structure. I even hid a small parabolic dish in the attic, aimed at the chimney, to capture the intricate conversations of the wind. The nerve center of this system was my workshop in the basement. The room was my sanctuary, soundproofed with thick layers of cork and acoustic foam, a quiet island where I could work without interruption. It was filled with the beautiful anachronistic machinery of my trade. A towering Studer reel-to-reel tape deck, a vintage Neve mixing console with its forest of smooth, weighted faders, and a bank of oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers, their green screens tracing the silent, elegant geometry of sound. The cables from the house's nervous system all led here, to this console. Seated in my worn leather chair, a pair of high-fidelity headphones over my ears, I was not in a basement. I was at the very heart of my home, a conductor listening to the quiet, constant symphony of its existence. I could hear the gentle sigh of the floorboards settling on the second floor, the frantic, secret scurrying of a mouse behind a wall, the low, mournful hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The house was alive, and I was its sole, devoted listener. In the world outside my front door, I perfected my performance of deafness. It became second nature. I learned to watch lips with a convincing intensity, to nod and smile in the right places, to cup my hand to my ear with a look of frustrated concentration. I turned the television in the living room up to a volume that was physically painful, a piece of stagecraft that never failed to convince my visitors of my affliction. My children, Leo and Cynthia, adapted to my new reality with a kind of weary, dutiful resignation. Their voices, when they spoke to me, became loud, slow, and overly simplified, the way one speaks to a foreigner or a child. They did not know that when they would turn their backs, lowering their voices to a conspiratorial whisper in the kitchen, their words would arrive in my ears with a pristine, studio-quality clarity. This quiet, bifurcated life suited me. I had retreated from the often tiring noise of human conversation, a world of imprecise words and half-formed thoughts, into a world of pure, unadulterated sound. The creak of a stair held more honest truth than most of the chatter I had been forced to endure in my life. The sound of the rain on the roof was a more eloquent statement than any political speech. My self-imposed silence was not an absence, but a refinement of my senses. It was a choice to listen to the world rather than just hear its noise. The system I had built was my companion, a way of feeling the pulse of my own small universe. It was a comfort, a hobby, a private obsession. I never imagined that it would one day become a weapon. I never imagined I would have to turn the full analytical power of my life's work against my own children. That was before they began to see my quiet world, not as a retreat, but as an opportunity. They came in with the practiced, slightly too loud cheerfulness that had become the standard operating procedure for their visits. Leo, my son, carried a bag of groceries, and my daughter Cynthia held a pot of orchids, its blossoms a lurid shade of purple. I met them at the door, performing my part, my head cocked to one side, a vague and pleasant smile on my face, as if I were struggling to place them. Their shouted greetings were a barrage of sound, artificially amplified to penetrate the fortress of my supposed deafness. I nodded and smiled, a benign and witless patriarch, and shuffled back towards the living room, leaving them to the familiar ritual of putting away the groceries and chattering about their lives. I settled into my large, worn armchair by the window, the deep cushions a familiar comfort. I picked up the newspaper from the side table, a prop I used to signal my complete and total disengagement from their presence. From their perspective, I was now safely occupied, a harmless piece of furniture, deaf and distracted by the day's headlines. I watched them as they moved about the kitchen, their mouths moving, their voices a distant, muffled rumble that I was not meant to hear. After a few minutes, seeing them settled at the kitchen table with cups of coffee, I made my move. With a slow, casual movement, as if adjusting my position in the chair, my hand slipped down to the side table. My fingers found the small, coiled cable and the familiar shape of my headphones. I discreetly plugged the jack into the small, unmarked socket I had installed in the chair's wooden base years ago. I then lifted the heavy, professional-grade headphones and settled them over my ears, an act that, to my children, would look like an old man trying to block out the world to better concentrate on his reading. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The muffled, distant world vanished, replaced by a soundscape of astonishing clarity and intimacy. The ambient noise of the house came alive, the low, resonant hum of the refrigerator's compressor, the gentle hiss of the pilot light on the stove, the faint, rhythmic ticking of the old regulator clock on the kitchen wall. And then, their voices. They were no longer a distant rumble. They were immediate, present, as if they were whispering directly into my ear. The fidelity of the microphones I had installed was, I noted with a grim sense of professional pride, impeccable. Cynthia's voice came first, low and conspiratorial, laced with a familiar, anxious guilt. She spoke of the house, of the rising property taxes, of the cost of maintaining such a large, old place. She framed her concern in the language of practicality, of a daughter worried about the burdens on her aging father. It was a carefully constructed preamble, an ethical justification for the conversation she truly wanted to have. Leo's reply was a low, impatient sound, the verbal equivalent of a hand waving away an annoying fly. He had no time for such delicate preambles. His voice was pragmatic, devoid of sentiment. He steered the conversation directly to the assets, the collection of paintings my wife and I had assembled over a lifetime, the antique furniture, the contents of my workshop. He spoke of them not as pieces of a life, but as dormant capital, as items on an inventory list waiting to be liquidated. I sat behind my newspaper, my eyes staring blankly at an article about municipal bonds, but my entire being was focused on the sounds in my ears. I was no longer a father in his own home. I was a surveillance operative, monitoring a hostile conversation. I heard Cynthia raise a weak objection, her voice a thin thread of conscience. She spoke of their mother, of how much these things had meant to her. Leo's response was swift and brutal. He spoke of insurance costs, of the risk of theft, of the burden of such valuable things on a man who couldn't even hear the doorbell ring. He used my own performance against me, my carefully crafted disability as the central pillar in his argument for my dispossession. Every word was a small, sharp betrayal, a casual desecration of my life and my wife's memory. The conspiracy deepened. They spoke of lawyers, of the legal mechanisms required to gain control. The term power of attorney was spoken, a clinical, legalistic phrase that in this context felt like a weapon. They discussed strategy, how best to approach me, how to frame the documents as a simple matter of estate planning to make things easier for everyone later on. They spoke of me in the third person, their voices calm and rational, as if they were surgeons discussing a patient under anesthesia, a man who could be cut into and rearranged for his own good, without his knowledge or his consent. The pain of it was a physical pressure in my chest, a cold, heavy weight. This was not a sudden, angry outburst. This was a calculated, premeditated act of familial treason, and they were planning it over coffee at my own kitchen table, not 10 yards from where I sat. When they had finished their plotting, I heard their chairs scrape against the floor. I prepared myself. I subtly removed the headphones, coiling the cable and tucking it away. I arranged my face back into its mask of benign vacancy. They entered the living room, their faces bright with the same false cheer they had arrived with. They shouted a few final caring questions about my day. I looked up from my newspaper, blinked as if slowly returning from a distant world, and gave them a soft, vague smile. I nodded, cupped my ear, and shrugged, a perfect pantomime of a man who had not heard a single word. They patted my shoulder and saw themselves out. I watched them go, and when the sound of their car had finally faded, I was left in the profound and terrible silence of my home, a silence now filled with the crystal-clear, perfectly recorded echo of their betrayal. After the sound of their car had completely faded, a new kind of silence descended upon the house. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, no longer the peaceful absence of noise I had cultivated, but a vacuum filled with the residue of their words, the toxic echo of their conspiracy. The cheerful, sunlit kitchen where they had sat and plotted now felt like a crime scene. I stood in the doorway between the living room and the dining room for a long time, a statue in the quiet aftermath, my hand still resting on the back of my armchair. The pain was a physical presence, a dull, cold weight settling in my chest, the kind of deep internal bleed that leaves no visible mark. It was the pain of a craftsman who has just discovered a fatal, structural flaw in his own most cherished creations. My first impulse was the raw, primal one of a betrayed father. I wanted to pick up the telephone, to confront them, to unleash a torrent of fury and hurt, to hear their denials and their justifications. But 50 years of my professional life had been dedicated to the opposite impulse. My work had taught me that the truth is rarely found in the loud, chaotic signal of emotion. It is found in the quiet, patient analysis of the recorded fact. An emotional outburst would be noise. It would be static. It would be a signal they could easily distort, using my anger as further proof of my instability. I was a man of science, of evidence, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I could not fight this battle as a father. I had to fight it as an engineer. My legs, feeling heavy and ancient, carried me not to the telephone, but to the basement door. I descended the old creaking wooden stairs, each step a deliberate movement away from the compromised world above and into the secure, controlled environment of my sanctuary. The air in the basement was cool and dry, and smelled of concrete, ozone, and old warm electronics. I locked the thick soundproof door behind me. Here I was in command. This was my laboratory, my listening post, my archive. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the silent, sleeping machinery of my life's work. The two large Studer reel-to-reel decks stood like stoic, gray sentinels. The vast Neve mixing console, with its intricate geography of knobs and faders, was a map of 1,000 sonic landscapes I had explored. The green circular screens of the oscilloscopes were dark, their dancing lines at rest. These were the tools of my trade, instruments designed to capture, to analyze, and to preserve the truth. I had been passively listening for years, a connoisseur of the house's quiet symphony. Their conversation in the kitchen had been just another sound wave, another piece of ambient data. But their words had changed the nature of my listening. It was no longer a passive act of appreciation. It now had to become an active, deliberate act of surveillance. The pain in my chest, the grief for the children I thought I knew, began to cool, to recede, replaced by a familiar cold and clarifying sense of professional purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was a forensic expert, and I had just been presented with a new, deeply personal, and profoundly ugly case. My first move was to secure the initial evidence. The conversation I had just overheard had been routed through my mixing board to my headphones, but I had also, out of sheer habit, had it recording to a small, solid-state digital recorder. I stopped the recording and saved the file, labeling it with a simple coded alphanumeric. The date and the time. This digital file was the raw intelligence, the initial field recording. But for my purposes, it was not enough. A digital file can be altered, questioned. For the official record, for evidence of an unimpeachable and permanent nature, I needed to transfer it to the format I trusted above all others: analog, magnetic tape. I walked to a large metal cabinet in the corner of the workshop, a cabinet where I kept my archives and my blank media. I slid open a long, flat drawer and looked at the rows of new, unused reel-to-reel tapes, each one sealed in its pristine plastic wrapping. I selected one, a 10-inch reel of high-grade, quarter-inch tape, the best I had. I unwrapped it with the care of a surgeon preparing his instruments. The clean, slightly chemical smell of the virgin tape was the smell of a new beginning. I mounted the full reel on the left spindle of the Studer deck and an empty take-up reel on the right. My hands, which had felt so old and useless upstairs, were now steady and sure. I threaded the dark, glossy tape through the complex path of the machine, around the tension arms, over the guide rollers, across the erase, record, and playback heads. A ritual my fingers could have performed in complete darkness. I secured the end of the tape to the take-up reel. The machine was ready. I connected the digital recorder to my mixing console. I played the recording of my children's conspiracy back once, not through headphones, but through my studio monitors, filling the soundproof room with their quiet, venomous words. I did not listen as a father. I listened as an engineer. I adjusted the equalization, filtering out the low hum of the refrigerator to bring their voices into sharper relief. I added a touch of compression to even out the levels of their whispers. I was preparing the evidence for archival, ensuring it was as clear and as intelligible as possible. Then I set the levels on the Studer. I cued the tape. I took a deep breath. I pressed the two large, solid buttons simultaneously, the red record and the green play. The heavy reels of the Studer began to turn with a smooth, silent, and powerful grace. The red record light glowed with a steady, watchful intensity. I watched as the crystal-clear audio signal of my children's voices flowed from the digital device, through my console, and into the recording head of the tape machine, where it was transformed into a permanent, unalterable magnetic pattern on the oxide surface of the tape. I was etching their betrayal into a medium that would outlast us all. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant hum beneath the surface. But now it had a purpose. It was being channeled, focused, transformed into a cold, hard, and permanent record. I sat back in my chair, the only light in the room, the glow of the VU meters and the single, red, unblinking eye of the recorder, and I watched the tape spin. The first recording was underway. The investigation had officially begun. With the first recording secured, the mission entered a new and more active phase. It was no longer enough to passively listen. I now had to actively cultivate the conditions for my children's conspiracy to flourish. I had to become the deaf, oblivious old man they believed me to be, not just in appearance, but in every interaction. My house was the theater. They were the audience, and I was about to give the performance of a lifetime. The core of any successful deception, as I knew from my work in audio forensics, is to build a narrative that the target wants to believe. My children wanted to believe I was incompetent, so I would give them incompetence in spades. They wanted to believe I was deaf, so I would become a creature of profound and absolute silence. My first act was to acquire a new prop. I drove to a medical supply store and purchased the largest, most comically outdated hearing aid I could find. It was a bulky, flesh-colored piece of plastic, a relic from an earlier, less subtle era of technology. It was a visual declaration of my infirmity, a piece of stagecraft that would be impossible for them to ignore. I began to wear it during the day, fumbling with the small dials, letting it produce a faint, annoying whistle that I would pretend not to notice. It was an uncomfortable, irritating device, but it was a crucial part of my costume. My next step was to recalibrate my own senses, to train myself to ignore the very things I had spent a lifetime learning to hear. I practiced not reacting when a car door slammed outside. I disciplined myself not to turn when the floorboards creaked behind me. The most difficult part was the television. I would turn it on to a news channel and crank the volume up to a roaring, distorted blast of noise that was physically painful to endure. I would sit in my armchair, the newspaper held before my face, and force myself to remain calm, to let the cacophony wash over me, all to create the perfect, unassailable illusion of a man who needed this much volume simply to hear. When Leo and Cynthia arrived for their next visit, the stage was set. I did not answer the doorbell, allowing it to chime unanswered several times. Finally, I heard the sound of their own key in the lock. They let themselves in, their voices loud and full of a practiced, exasperated concern. They found me in my armchair, my head slumped to one side, the television blaring, a perfect tableau of elderly neglect. I allowed myself to be startled, awake, blinking at them with a wide-eyed, foggy confusion. The performance was grueling. They would shout questions at me, their faces inches from mine. I would watch their lips move, a skill I had actually begun to develop, and then I would provide an answer that was completely disconnected from their question. Cynthia would ask, her voice a strained, high-pitched yell, if I had eaten lunch. I would smile a vague, pleasant smile and respond with a comment about the weather, about the likelihood of rain. I would see her and Leo exchange a look, a shared, silent confirmation of their own narrative. He's completely gone. I was a broken transmitter, receiving their signals but sending back nothing but corrupted, nonsensical data. And they believed it. Inwardly, my mind was a place of heightened, razor-sharp clarity. While I was outwardly portraying a mind lost in a fog, I was inwardly analyzing their every move. I was the audio engineer, filtering out the noise, their loud, pointless questions to me, and focusing entirely on the signal, the quiet, meaningful communication between them. I watched their micro-expressions. I saw the flicker of greed in Leo's eyes when he thought I was not looking, his gaze sweeping over the paintings on the wall. I saw the guilt in the way Cynthia could not quite meet my eye, her gestures of concern just a little too broad, a little too theatrical. They believed they were the ones in control, the competent adults managing a difficult situation. They had no idea that they were the subjects of a relentless, ongoing analysis, their every word and action being recorded and assessed. During a moment when they were both in the kitchen, their voices lowered to what they believed was a confidential volume, I put on my headphones, my movements shielded by the newspaper. The signal was pristine. I heard them discussing the next step. The word appraiser was used. They were planning to bring in a professional to value the art, a man they would introduce to me as a simple friend. As I listened to them hatch this next phase of their betrayal, a memory came to me. I was in my old lab, years ago, working on a federal case. I had a surveillance tape from a noisy restaurant, and the prosecution needed to isolate the voice of a single man at a distant table. I had spent 3 days applying filters, canceling frequencies, and slowly, painstakingly, pulling his quiet, incriminating words from the loud, chaotic mess of the surrounding restaurant. I was doing the same thing now. I was filtering out the loud, meaningless noise of their feigned concern and locking onto the quiet, true signal of their conspiracy. The technique was the same. The only difference was that the noise, this time, was the sound of my own children's voices, shouting their love at me. When they left, after a final, patronizing pat on my shoulder, I waited for the sound of their car to fade completely. I turned off the blaring television, and the sudden, blessed silence was a physical relief. I removed the clunky, uncomfortable hearing aid from my ear and placed it on the table. The performance was over for the day. I went to my study, my mind clear and cold. I had a new set of data points to enter into the log. The enemy was growing bolder. The conspiracy was escalating. And my recording, the silent magnetic witness to it all, was growing richer and more damning with every visit. Each night, after my children had departed, leaving behind a wake of feigned affection and the lingering scent of their ambition, my true work would begin. The performance of the deaf, doddering father would end the moment I heard the sound of their car engine fade into the distance. I would turn down the blaring television, remove the clumsy prop of my hearing aid, and the house would return to its true, quiet state. This was the time I would descend the stairs to my basement, to the soundproofed sanctuary of my workshop. This was when the archivist would begin his nightly task of processing and cataloging the day's acquisitions. The heart of this new, grim project was a large, cloth-bound ledger, a book of the sort used for keeping the permanent accounts of a serious business. Its pages were of a heavy, cream-colored stock, faintly lined, with numbered pages that made any removal or alteration immediately apparent. This was not a diary for the recording of my feelings. It was a logbook, an official and immutable record of a conspiracy. My first action each night was to retrieve the reel of tape from the Studer deck. I would handle the large, heavy reel with a practiced care, its dark, glossy surface now encoded with the magnetic ghosts of my children's voices. I would place it on a second, smaller machine I used for playback and analysis, a machine wired not to studio monitors, but to my headphones. I would sit in the deep, enveloping silence of my workshop and listen to the day's recording. This was not a passive act of rehearing the betrayal. It was a cold, professional analysis. With my headphones on, the world outside the recording ceased to exist. I was immersed in the soundscape of my own kitchen, a fly on my own wall. I would listen for nuances I might have missed in the moment. The slight, nervous tremor in Cynthia's voice when she spoke of legal documents, the arrogant, dismissive confidence in Leo's tone when he spoke of my obliviousness. I would watch the green, dancing line of the oscilloscope, seeing the visual representation of their deceit, the sharp, aggressive peaks of their greed, the low, flat valleys of their guilt. I was not a father, listening in pain. I was a forensic engineer, examining a piece of contaminated audio for its core, evidentiary signal. When the analysis was complete, I would open the logbook. My pen, a heavy black fountain pen with a fine, German-made nib, moved across the page with a steady, unhurried purpose. The process was a rigid, unvarying ritual. At the top of each new entry, I would write the date and a unique, sequential tape identification number. For example, tape ID 005, date 15 October 2025. Then I would begin the transcription. I did not transcribe the entire conversation, only the most legally and emotionally significant portions. I would note the precise time code from the tape machine's digital counter, creating a direct, verifiable link between my written record and the audio evidence. An entry might read, 143112, C expresses concern regarding the legal validity of a power of attorney document if my mental state is questioned. 143204, L dismisses concern, stating my deafness and general vagueness as a benefit, arguing no one would believe I was capable of understanding the document well enough to contest it. I transcribed their words with a chilling, surgical detachment. I was the court reporter at the trial of my own family. After the transcription, I would add a separate section, labeled Analyst's Notes. Here I would add my own professional observations. Vocal stress analysis indicates C is acting under duress from L. Leo's speech is confident, showing no signs of doubt or moral reservation. Background audio clear of anomalies. Recording is of high evidentiary quality. As I wrote, my mind would travel back to the case that had made my career, the investigation of a corrupt union boss. I remembered the weeks I had spent in a similar basement lab, working with a single, terribly recorded cassette tape from a hidden body wire. The recording was a mess of background noise, of clattering dishes and loud music. But I had worked on it, filtering, equalizing, using every tool and trick I had ever learned, until from the depths of the sonic mud, a single clear sentence had emerged, a sentence that had sent a powerful man to prison for 20 years. The work I was doing now felt exactly the same. I was taking the messy, emotional noise of my children's betrayal and refining it, purifying it, until all that remained was the cold, hard, and undeniable evidence of their intent. The archive grew. In a fireproof metal cabinet in the corner of the workshop, the collection of labeled tape reels grew, a silent, magnetic library of deceit. The logbook itself grew heavier, its pages filling with my neat, precise script. It was a terrible and beautiful thing, a document of profound sadness and of perfect, crystalline clarity. It was a testament to a father's broken heart, but it was also a masterpiece of forensic documentation, a case file so thorough, so cross-referenced, so meticulously assembled, that it would be, in the end, unassailable. Each night, after the final entry was made, I would lock the logbook and the day's tape away in the cabinet. I would turn off the warm, glowing tubes of my equipment and sit for a moment in the deep, perfect silence of the soundproofed room. The work was grim, but it gave me a purpose. I was no longer just a victim. I was the chief investigator and the star witness in the slow, patient, and methodical construction of a perfect case. The plan, as I had overheard it during one of their kitchen conspiracies, was to be executed with a simple, almost elegant, deception. My son, Leo, would bring a man to the house under the guise of a casual visit. The man would be introduced as an old colleague, an art history enthusiast who simply wished to see the collection of paintings that my late wife, Martha, and I had so lovingly assembled over the years. I, in my state of blissful, deafened ignorance, was to suspect nothing. I was to play the part of the genial, doddery host, flattered by the attention. The true purpose of the man's visit, of course, was to conduct a thorough and professional appraisal of every valuable object in my home, the first concrete step in the process of its liquidation. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I had seen them coming, Leo's polished sedan pulling into my driveway, and had composed myself for the performance. I feigned not to hear the doorbell and made them wait, finally opening the door with a look of mild, befuddled surprise. The man beside my son was exactly as I had pictured him, middle-aged, dressed in a quiet, expensive suit, with the soft, well-manicured hands of someone who does not work with them. He carried a slim leather briefcase. His eyes, however, were not soft. They were sharp, quick, and constantly moving, the eyes of a man who is accustomed to assessing value in a single sweeping glance. He was the appraiser. Leo performed the introductions, his voice a booming, unnatural shout meant to penetrate my supposed deafness. He presented the man as an old friend, his name a forgettable blur of syllables that I was not expected to retain. I smiled my vague, pleasant smile, nodded, and shook the man's hand, my own grip deliberately frail. I then shuffled ahead of them into the living room, gesturing for them to follow, the perfect picture of a gracious but oblivious old man. I settled myself into my large armchair, picked up my newspaper, and with a final dismissive wave, I indicated that they should feel free to look around. Then, as their backs were turned, I slipped on my headphones, my own private portal into their secret world. The performance began. I heard Leo's voice, now at a normal conversational volume, guiding the appraiser toward the first painting, a large dramatic seascape that Martha and I had bought on a trip to Maine. The appraiser's response was a low, professional murmur, his words a clinical assessment of the artist's brushwork, the condition of the canvas, the quality of the light. He was good at his job. Then I heard the soft, unmistakable click of a metal tape measure being extended and retracted. He was measuring the frame for his notes. He was not an admirer. He was a cataloger. For the next hour, I sat behind the shield of my newspaper, a silent, unseen audience to the systematic deconstruction of my own life. They moved from room to room, their footsteps echoing faintly on the hardwood floors, their voices a clear, constant stream of data in my ears. I listened as the appraiser reduced Martha's cherished collection of porcelain figurines to a series of lot numbers and estimated values. I heard him assess the grandfather clock in the hall, a piece that had been in her family for 3 generations, commenting not on its history, but on the market demand for its particular style of woodwork. Each object, saturated with a lifetime of memory and personal significance, was being stripped bare, its soul extracted and replaced with a cold, hard number. My children's voices were a painful counterpoint to the appraiser's professional drone. They were not interested in the art history or the craftsmanship. Their questions were sharp, practical, and laced with a greedy, impatient energy. I heard Cynthia ask about the best auction houses, her voice a low, urgent whisper. I heard Leo ask about the appraiser's commission, about how quickly the items could be brought to market. They spoke of discretion and the need for a private sale. At one point, the appraiser, in a gesture of professional courtesy, came into the living room and stood before my chair. He shouted a compliment at me about the seascape, his voice full of a false, patronizing warmth. I looked up from my paper, smiled my most vacant smile, and nodded, as if agreeing with a sentiment I had not heard. Meanwhile, in my headphones, I could hear Leo, still in the other room, speaking quietly on his phone to a financial advisor, his conversation a low, excited murmur about significant incoming liquidity. As I sat there, a ghost in my own home, listening to the assets of my past being inventoried for my future funeral, a memory came to me. It was of a small, dusty antique shop Martha and I had wandered into, on a rainy Saturday afternoon 30 years ago. I remembered the moment she had first seen the grandfather clock, the way her face had lit up with a child's pure, unadulterated delight. It was identical, she had whispered to me, to the one that had stood in her own grandfather's house. We could not afford it, not really, but we had bought it anyway. A beautiful, extravagant, and utterly impractical purchase made for no other reason than the pure joy it brought her. I remembered the struggle of getting it home, the two of us laughing as we tried to maneuver it through the doorway. That clock was not an asset. It was a repository of joy, a monument to a moment of shared, spontaneous happiness. And in my ears, I could hear my son asking the appraiser if it would be better to sell it on the East Coast or the West Coast to maximize the return. When they had finished, they gathered in the kitchen for a final, quiet conference. I heard the rustle of paper as the appraiser presented them with his preliminary, handwritten notes. I heard their low whistles of surprise at the final estimated total. The sound was one of pure, unadulterated greed. They left soon after, their faces glowing with the triumphant, conspiratorial excitement. They shouted their goodbyes to me, their voices full of the same false affection, and I waved them away with a tired, grandfatherly gesture. I waited until the sound of their car had completely vanished. I took off my headphones. The house was quiet. I walked to the grandfather clock in the hall and ran my hand over its smooth, cool, wooden case. The sound of its steady, rhythmic ticking was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a heart, still beating. I went down to my workshop. I had a new and particularly valuable recording to archive. The successful valuation of the contents of my house seemed to have emboldened them. The period of quiet that followed the appraiser's visit was short, a brief and deceptive lull before the next phase of their campaign commenced. I knew it was coming. In a previously recorded conversation, logged as Tape Sire Rizzo 7, I had heard them planning it. The cover story this time was to be Cynthia's. She would bring a woman to the house, an acquaintance of hers, introduced as an interior decorator who was simply looking for inspiration for another project. The woman's true profession, of course, was real estate. They were moving from the inventory to the container, from the assets within the house to the house itself. My home, the physical structure that had sheltered my family and my life for more than 50 years, was now the subject of their cold and calculating gaze. She arrived with Cynthia on a bright, cold Wednesday morning. The real estate agent was a woman whose entire being radiated a polished, predatory competence. Her suit was sharp, her smile was wide and brilliant, and her eyes, as she stepped into the foyer, were not the eyes of a guest admiring a home. They were the eyes of a surveyor assessing a parcel of land. They scanned the height of the ceilings, the width of the entryway, the quality of the original hardwood floors, her mind already performing a swift, silent calculation of square footage and market appeal. Cynthia performed the shouted introductions, her voice a shrill performance of casual friendship. I played my part, the slow, smiling, deaf old man, nodding graciously and shuffling out of their way, flattered by the professional interest in my humble abode. I retreated to my designated post in the living room, to the deep, familiar safety of my armchair. I raised my newspaper, a shield of feigned obliviousness, and as they began their tour, I fitted the headphones over my ears and opened the channel. The violation this time felt deeper, more invasive. The appraiser had been focused on objects, on the portable pieces of my past. This woman was assessing the very bones of my life. Her voice, a crisp, professional alto, came through my headphones with perfect clarity as she and Cynthia moved through the downstairs rooms. She spoke in a language of pure commerce. My living room was not a place of memory, but a generously proportioned space with excellent natural light. The dining room, where Martha and I had hosted 50 years of holiday dinners, was a formal entertaining area with significant potential for modernization. I heard her tap her manicured fingernail against the hand-carved mahogany of the fireplace mantel, and I heard her low, appreciative murmur, not of its beauty, but of its value as a key selling feature. Cynthia's voice was a low, eager counterpoint, asking questions about comps in the neighborhood, about the optimal time of year to list a property. Then I heard Leo's voice join them. He must have let himself in the back door while I was occupied with my performance. His presence added a new layer of aggressive impatience to the proceedings. He had no time for discussions of curb appeal or cosmetic upgrades. He wanted numbers. I listened as the three of them stood in my kitchen and discussed the probable listing price of my home, a number of shocking and significant size. They spoke of my life's sanctuary as if it were a publicly traded stock whose value had just reached its peak. The most difficult part of the ordeal came when they ascended the main staircase. The microphone in the upstairs hallway was particularly sensitive, and I could hear their footsteps, their voices, as if they were in the next room. I listened as this stranger, this woman with the brilliant smile and the cold, calculating eyes, walked through my private, personal spaces. I heard her enter my study, and I heard her comment on its potential as a home office or a nursery. Then they moved to the master bedroom, the room I had shared with Martha, the room where she had passed away. The microphone in that room was one I had installed to listen to the sound of the rain on the roof, a sound she had always loved. Now, it was transmitting the sound of my life being sold. I heard the agent's clinical assessment of the room's dimensions. I heard her suggest that the old floral wallpaper Martha had chosen with such care would have to be stripped away, that the room should be repainted in a neutral, soulless shade of gray. I heard her talk about the ensuite bathroom, about how a full renovation could add $10,000 to $15,000 to the asking price. I sat in my chair, the newspaper trembling in my hands, my body rigid with a cold, silent, and impotent fury. This was a desecration. A memory, intense and bittersweet, surfaced. The day we had first moved into this house, I had carried Martha over the threshold into this very bedroom. The room had been empty then, full of nothing but sunlight and the infinite promise of our future together. Now, it was being discussed as a commodity, its sacredness measured in the cold, hard currency of potential profit. Their final conversation took place in the foyer as they prepared to leave. The agent's voice was full of professional encouragement. She outlined the next steps. She spoke of the legal paperwork, of the necessity of a clear and uncontested power of attorney to ensure a smooth and efficient transaction. Cynthia's voice was a murmur of agreement. Leo's was a confident, final statement about handling the legal side of things, about getting me to sign the necessary papers in the coming weeks. They were no longer just conspiring. They were finalizing the logistics of the theft. They came into the living room to say their goodbyes. I looked up from my newspaper, my face a carefully composed mask of pleasant, deafened ignorance. Cynthia shouted that her decorator friend had found the house very inspiring. I smiled and nodded. The agent gave me a bright, pitying look, the kind one gives to a child or a pet. Leo clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of proprietary ownership. Then they were gone. I waited, listening until the sound of their cars had completely vanished. I took off my headphones. The silence in the house was absolute. I stood up and began my own slow, solitary tour, walking through the rooms that had just been so thoroughly violated. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent witness to its impending murder. I went down to my workshop. The empty reel on the Studer was waiting. I had a new and exquisitely painful recording to add to the archive. The archive in my basement was now a library of malice, a comprehensive and growing collection of my own children's treachery. The tape reels, neatly labeled and stacked in their metal boxes, formed a silent, magnetic chorus of their greed. My logbook, its pages now more than half filled with my precise, sterile script, was a damning narrative of their escalating conspiracy. I had the evidence. It was pure, it was verifiable, and it was absolute. Yet, as I sat in the soundproof quiet of my workshop, listening back to the latest recording, the cold commercial assessment of my home by the real estate agent, a new and unwelcome feeling began to settle over me. It was a sense of profound and paralyzing uncertainty. I was an engineer. I was an analyst. My entire professional life had been dedicated to the science of acoustics, to the art of extracting the signal from the noise. I had been the man in the lab, the expert witness who would present the authenticated recording to the lawyers, the one who would explain the technical certainties of the evidence to a jury. I was the provider of the weapon, not the one who wielded it. I understood frequencies and waveforms, not subpoenas and torts. I had built a perfect, unassailable case file, but I had absolutely no idea how to deploy it as a legal force. My recordings, as potent as they were just silent tapes on a shelf without the skill of a legal strategist to bring them to life in the proper theater of war. To act alone, to simply confront my children with the tapes, would be a clumsy, emotional, and amateurish move. It would be an act of a wounded father, not a calculating operative. I knew, with a certainty born of a lifetime of professional discipline, that I could not proceed alone. I needed an ally. The decision of who to trust with my secret, with my life's most painful and dangerous project, was not a difficult one. There was only one name: Ben Carter. We had known each other for nearly 70 years, since our days as boys in a neighborhood that no longer existed. He had been a litigator, a courtroom brawler with a brilliant, pragmatic mind and a core of integrity that was as solid and unbendable as granite. He was retired now, but I knew that the mind of a man like Ben never truly retires. It simply waits for a new problem to solve. He was also one of the few friends who had adapted to my deafness, not with pity or condescension, but with a quiet, practical patience. I went to my old, leather-bound address book and found his number. I dialed, and when he answered, I simply made my regular annual invitation for him to come to my home for a game of chess and a glass of whiskey, shouting the words into the receiver with my best, most convincing, deaf man's bellow. He arrived that evening, his presence a comfortable and familiar warmth in the cold stillness of my house. We went through the familiar rituals of our friendship. I had set up the chessboard in the living room. We played our game, a long, silent, and complex battle of wits. He spoke to me loudly and clearly, and I responded with my usual vague nods and misplaced smiles, a performance that felt deeply dishonest in the presence of a man I respected so profoundly. After the game, I poured us both a generous measure of whiskey. He sat in the armchair opposite mine, and we drank in a quiet, companionable silence. Then, when the time felt right, I made my move. Instead of gesturing for another game, I stood and beckoned for him to follow me. A look of mild, friendly curiosity crossed his face as I led him not to the kitchen for a refill, but to the heavy, insulated door of my basement workshop. He had never been in my workshop before. I saw him take in the rows of professional equipment, the soundproofing on the walls, his curiosity deepening. This was a side of his old friend's life he had never seen. I did not try to explain. I gestured for him to sit in the comfortable, worn leather client chair that faced my mixing console. He sat, his eyes full of unspoken questions. I then went to the metal cabinet and retrieved a single reel of tape. It was not one of the originals. It was a copy, a carefully edited compilation I had prepared for this very purpose, a 15-minute summary of the most damning moments from all my recordings. I threaded the tape onto the Studer deck. Then I took my finest pair of studio headphones, the ones with the perfect uncolored frequency response, and gently, respectfully, placed them over his ears. He looked at me, his eyebrows raised. I simply pointed to the play button. I sat at my console and pressed the large green button. The reels began to turn. I did not put on a second pair of headphones. I knew the contents of the tape by heart. Instead, I watched him. I watched the face of my oldest friend as he was granted access to the secret, ugly war I had been fighting. I saw the initial look of confusion as he heard the clear, intimate sounds of my kitchen. Then, as the voices of my children began their conspiratorial murmur, I saw his brow furrow. His body, which had been relaxed, became tense, rigid. His eyes, which had been soft with the warmth of old friendship, hardened, narrowed, becoming the sharp, analytical eyes of the prosecutor he once was. He did not flinch. He did not move a muscle. He simply listened, his entire being focused on the voices in his ears. I watched his jaw tighten as he heard my son discuss commissions with the appraiser. I saw a flash of pure, cold fury in his eyes as he heard my daughter and the real estate agent discuss the mechanics of the power of attorney. He was not just hearing a conversation, he was absorbing the full, calculated, and breathtaking scope of the betrayal. When the tape hissed into silence at the end of the reel, he did not immediately remove the headphones. He sat for a long, still moment, as if allowing the final toxic echoes to fade from his mind. Then, slowly, he took them off and placed them carefully on the console before him. The silence in the soundproofed room was absolute. He looked at me. His face was grim, set like stone. He looked at the slowly spinning take-up reel on the Studer. He looked at the neat, ominous stack of other tapes in their metal boxes. Then he looked back at me. In his eyes I saw not pity, but a deep and terrible anger, an anger on my behalf. He had just been presented with the evidence, and his brilliant legal mind was already processing it, seeing the patterns, the connections, the potential for both civil and criminal action. He did not need to speak. He gave me a single, hard, decisive nod. It was a gesture that said everything. I understand. I am with you, and we will make them pay. The turning point had been crossed. My solitary secret operation had just gained a commander for its legal assault. The dynamic of my quiet, solitary war was fundamentally altered by Ben's silent, furious nod of allegiance. My basement workshop, for decades my private sanctuary, transformed into a two-man command center, a war room for our final, decisive campaign. Ben began arriving every morning, bringing with him the tools of his own trade. He would place his worn leather briefcase on my workbench, and from it, he would produce thick, intimidating legal tomes, stacks of fresh yellow legal pads, and a modern, efficient laptop that looked alien next to the analog warmth of my vintage equipment. The sight of his law books resting beside my reel-to-reel tape decks was a visual representation of the powerful new alliance we had formed. My forensic evidence and his legal fury. Our first and most laborious task was the conversion of the audio evidence into a format that the legal world would understand. The magnetic patterns on my tapes held the truth, but it was a truth that needed to be translated into the cold, hard text of a legal document. We began the painstaking process of creating certified transcripts. My role was that of the lead technician. I would thread a new tape onto the Studer, cue it to the beginning of a conversation, and play it back. My hands on the faders of my mixing console, my ears attuned to every nuance. I would adjust the equalization to make their voices stand out from the ambient noise of the kitchen, and I would use my filters to remove the low-frequency hum of the refrigerator. I was preparing the audio for its official testimony, ensuring it was as clean and as undeniably clear as possible. Ben's role was that of the scribe and the legal analyst. He sat beside me, a pair of studio-grade headphones identical to my own over his ears, his fingers poised over the keyboard of his laptop. I would play a short segment of the recording, a single incriminating sentence, and then I would pause the tape. In the profound, soundproofed silence, The only sound would be the rapid, angry clatter of his keyboard as he transcribed their words. He was not merely typing, he was a prosecutor, listening with a trained ear for the specific phrases and admissions that would build our case. He would occasionally have me replay a section, his brow furrowed in concentration, wanting to be certain of the exact inflection, the exact wording. He was a craftsman of a different sort, his raw material the careless, greedy words of my children. As I listened to their voices, over and over, stripped of all context but their own conspiracy, the emotional toll was immense. The words, which had been so painful to hear the first time, were now subjected to a slow, repetitive, and clinical dissection that somehow made them even worse. During the transcription of one of Cynthia's conversations, where she spoke with a chilling practicality about the logistics of moving me into a small, manageable apartment, a memory broke through my professional detachment. I saw her as a little girl, no older than 5, in the middle of the night, woken by a nightmare. I remembered carrying her, her small, trusting body warm against my chest, as I walked through the silent rooms of this very house, assuring her that she was safe, that I would always keep her safe. The contrast between the memory of her innocent, trusting voice and the cold, calculating voice now coming from the tape machine was a physical blow, a wave of grief and loss so profound that I had to pause the tape and close my eyes until it passed. We worked with a grim, methodical purpose. Each completed transcript was printed, given an exhibit number, and cross-referenced with the corresponding tape ID and logbook entry. We were building a fortress of paper, a case so thoroughly documented, so meticulously cross-referenced, that it would be, in Ben's words, a legal sledgehammer. When the transcriptions were complete, Ben's work shifted. He was no longer a scribe, but a strategist, a weaponsmith. He began to draft the legal documents that would serve as our ammunition. He drafted 2 formal letters, printed them on his own intimidating, retired attorney's letterhead. They were addressed to the appraiser and the real estate agent. The letters were masterpieces of polite, veiled threat. They did not accuse, but simply stated that their services had been rendered as part of an ongoing investigation into a case of potential conspiracy to commit elder fraud. They were being formally put on notice as material witnesses. The letters were designed to shock them, to sever their loyalty to my children, and to ensure their full cooperation when the time came. The final document, the centerpiece of our legal arsenal, was a long, detailed memorandum addressed to my children, Leo and Cynthia. It was not a letter from a father. It was a legal brief from an adversary. Ben spent 2 days perfecting it. In cold, dispassionate language, it outlined the full scope of their conspiracy, referencing the specific, time-stamped evidence contained in the transcripts. It cited the relevant state and federal statutes they had violated. It detailed the potential civil and criminal penalties, fines, restitution, and the very real possibility of prison sentences. It was not an emotional appeal. It was a cold, brutal, and comprehensive recitation of the consequences of their actions. It was a declaration of war. When the work was done, a thick, heavy binder sat on my workbench. It contained everything: copies of my logbook entries, the notarized transcripts of their own words, and the legal documents Ben had drafted. Ben took the final memorandum, folded it, and sealed it in one of his own official envelopes. He handed it to me. This was the weapon. It was heavier, colder, and more final than any tool I had ever held in my hand. We sat in the silent workshop, 2 old men, 2 old friends, the fruits of our grim labor resting between us. The time for gathering intelligence was over. The time for preparing for battle had come to an end. All that was left was to choose the time and place for the final, devastating confrontation. The completed legal binder, a thick and formidable document of my children's own making, was now in the possession of Ben Carter. My workshop, which had for weeks been a command center and a scriptorium, returned to its state of quiet, suspended animation. The tapes were archived. The logbook was closed. Our weapon was forged and in the hands of our legal commander. Now, the most difficult phase of the operation began: the waiting. Our strategy, as Ben had outlined it with a cold, clear logic, was one of reaction. We would not make the first move. We would not send the threatening letters. We would wait for them to make their final, fatal error. We would let them walk into the ambush we had so carefully prepared. My performance, therefore, had to be more convincing than ever. I was the bait in the trap, and my apparent helplessness was the scent that would draw them in. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in sustained, disciplined deception. I endured my children's visits with a new sense of profound, internal detachment. I was an actor in the final, repetitive run of a long play, my lines and movements so ingrained that I could perform them without thought. I smiled my vacant smile as they shouted their condescending pleasantries. I nodded with a placid, uncomprehending look as they discussed my life in front of me, as if I were a piece of furniture. I was a ghost in my own home, a man whose physical presence had been entirely discounted, and this was the precise condition necessary for the trap to succeed. Their confidence, in the absence of any resistance from me, grew into a bold and careless arrogance. Their conversations in the kitchen, which I continued to monitor with a professional's diligence, were no longer tinged with the slight, nervous guilt of the early days. Their voices now held a tone of triumphant certainty. They had the appraisals. They had the strategy. All that remained was the final, simple, mechanical act of securing my signature. I listened to them discuss their plans for the money, the new cars they would buy, the investments they would make, the debts they would finally pay off. They were dividing up the spoils of a victory they had not yet won, so sure of the outcome that they had forgotten the battle was not yet over. As I sat in my armchair, the newspaper a meaningless collection of symbols in my lap, the sound of their confident plotting a clear, crisp signal in my ears, a memory from my old life surfaced. I remembered a case I had consulted on for the FBI, a sting operation against a powerful racketeer. I had been in a surveillance van, my headphones pressed tight against my ears, listening to a live wiretap. I had listened for hours to the target's voice, a voice full of a brash, swaggering arrogance as he detailed his criminal enterprise to an undercover agent, utterly convinced of his own untouchability. I remembered the profound, cold satisfaction I had felt in that van, the feeling of being a silent, invisible witness to a man meticulously and eloquently engineering his own downfall. I felt that same cold satisfaction now. My children, in their arrogance, were doing the same thing. They were providing a perfect, clear, and continuous record of their own conspiracy. The summons to the final confrontation came on a Tuesday. It was Cynthia who delivered it. She came alone, her face arranged in a mask of gentle, loving concern. She sat on the ottoman in front of my chair, and shouting in a slow, patient cadence, she explained the purpose of her visit. It was time, she explained, for a family meeting. There were some important papers to sign, a simple matter of estate planning that their lawyer had drawn up to make things easier for me in the future. She spoke of the need to have everything in order, to protect me. Her performance was impeccable. She was the very picture of the dutiful, caring daughter. She informed me that their lawyer would be present to ensure everything was official and above board. She proposed a date, the coming Saturday. I looked at her, my face a carefully blank canvas. I watched her lips move, and I let a long calculated pause hang in the air, the pause of a man whose mind is slow to process information. Then I gave a slow, vague, and compliant nod. I smiled my most convincing, witless smile. My easy acquiescence was the final confirmation she needed. The deaf, senile old man would be no trouble at all. He would sign whatever was put in front of him. She patted my hand, her touch light and triumphant, and left, convinced that the final piece of her plan had just clicked perfectly into place. The moment the front door closed behind her, the performance ended. I took off my headphones. The house was silent. The invitation had been issued. The final trap was now officially baited. I walked to the telephone and dialed Ben's number. I did not speak when he answered. I simply let it ring 3 times, our prearranged signal that the meeting was on. And then, I hung up. The final preparations were now in motion. I spent the rest of that week in a state of profound, almost serene, calm. The anxiety of the waiting was over. All the variables were now known, all the pieces in their final positions on the board. My children had not only walked into the trap, they had, with their own arrogant hands, scheduled the very moment it would spring. I was no longer the bait. I was the patient, silent hunter, waiting in the blind for the quarry to step into the clearing. On the morning of the designated Saturday, I prepared my home not for a visit, but for a final, formal proceeding. I did not create the usual stagecraft of neglect. Instead, I restored the house to its natural state of quiet, meticulous order. I dusted every surface. I polished the long mahogany dining room table until it shone like a dark, still lake. I arranged 6 chairs around it, 3 on each side, a formal and confrontational seating arrangement that was a stark departure from our usual casual gatherings. On the large bookshelf that stood against the far wall of the dining room, among the leather-bound volumes of my wife's favorite novels, I placed a small, discreet, but very powerful studio-quality speaker, its black grille nearly invisible in the shadows. The trap was set. The theater was ready for its final act. They arrived precisely at 2 o'clock. Leo, Cynthia, and a man I had never seen before, a man in a sharp suit with a smooth, confident face and a briefcase that looked expensive. Their lawyer. They entered the house with an air of triumphant finality, their faces arranged in masks of solemn, loving concern. I saw them register the unusual tidiness of the house, and I saw the look they exchanged, a look of satisfaction, believing my good state was a sign of compliance, that the difficult business would now proceed smoothly. I played my part, the frail deaf host, nodding and smiling vaguely as I led them into the dining room. I gestured for them to sit, and I took my own place at the head of the table. Their lawyer began the proceedings. He spoke in a loud, slow, patronizing voice, the kind one uses for the very young or the very old. He spoke of my children's deep love for me, of their desire to protect my legacy, of the need to simplify my affairs. His words were a thick, syrupy river of condescending lies, and I listened, my face a mask of placid, uncomprehending patience. He then unlatched his briefcase and produced a thick sheaf of documents. He slid them across the polished table toward me. A durable power of attorney, a series of property transfer agreements. It was a complete and total abdication of my life and my assets, rendered in dense, impenetrable legalese. He pushed a heavy, expensive-looking fountain pen beside the documents. I looked down at the papers. I looked at the pen. I looked up at the faces of my children. I saw the greedy, impatient anticipation in their eyes, the barely concealed triumph. They were at the finish line. They believed they had won. I reached out my hand, my fingers deliberately trembling, and I wrapped them around the smooth, cool barrel of the pen. I lifted it from the table, and in that moment of their absolute, certain victory, the doorbell chimed, its clear, bright notes a shocking intrusion into the tense, quiet room. All 3 of them started, their heads swiveling toward the sound. I placed the pen back down on the table, my expression one of mild, doddery confusion. I slowly rose from my chair and shuffled out of the dining room. I walked to the front door and opened it. On the porch stood Ben Carter. He was dressed in his old retired litigator's uniform, a perfectly pressed, conservative, dark suit. He carried a worn but clearly expensive leather briefcase. I stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. He walked past me into the foyer. I then led him into the dining room. The expressions on my children's faces when we entered were a study in pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly curdled into anger. Cynthia's mouth opened slightly. Leo's face flushed a dark, mottled red. Their lawyer stared, his professional composure completely shattered by the arrival of this unknown and clearly formidable new player. Ben paid them no mind. He walked to the empty chair beside me, placed his briefcase on the floor, and sat down, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked at me and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The time had come. I did not look at the documents in front of me again. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and took out a small, simple remote control. I placed it on the table. My children and their lawyer stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. I pressed a single black button. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, from the bookshelf against the wall, a voice filled the room. My son's voice. Crystal clear, perfectly intelligible, as if he were sitting right there. The old man won't suspect a thing. He thinks you're just my friend. The recording continued. The voice of the appraiser, clinically listing the value of my paintings. Then Cynthia's voice, a low, urgent whisper, discussing auction commissions. The blood drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, corpse-like white. Leo was frozen, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. The recording shifted to the real estate agent's visit. Her bright, professional voice echoed through the dining room, discussing the market value of my home. And then, Cynthia's voice again, asking the crucial question about the current occupant and the need for a power of attorney. Their lawyer, the smooth, confident man in the expensive suit, looked as if he had been physically struck. He was listening to irrefutable proof of a criminal conspiracy, a conspiracy in which he was now an unwitting and deeply compromised participant. When the final, damning sentence had been spoken, I pressed the button again. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier, more profound than any sound. It was the silence of absolute, total ruin. In that silence, Ben Carter leaned forward. He opened his briefcase. He took out the thick bound binder we had prepared. He did not say a word. He simply slid it, with a slow, deliberate motion, across the polished surface of the table until it came to rest directly in front of my children's lawyer. The lawyer stared down at the cover page, at the title Ben had printed in bold, stark letters. Evidence and transcripts in the matter of the conspiracy to defraud Walter Finch. His hands trembled as he reached out and opened it to the first page. My children did not move. They were statues, monuments to their own greed, broken and exposed in the quiet, terrible silence of my dining room. The silence that followed the end of the recording was a physical entity, a thick, heavy presence that filled the dining room and pressed down on us with an unbearable weight. In that silence, the sounds of their own voices, their own confident, greedy words, still seemed to echo from the walls. The scene was a frozen tableau of ruin. My son, Leo, sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of ashen, bloodless shock. My daughter, Cynthia, had her hands clapped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. And their lawyer, the smooth, confident man in the expensive suit, was staring at the small, unassuming speaker on the bookshelf, as if it were the head of a gorgon that had just turned his entire case, and perhaps his career, to stone. The first to break the paralysis was the lawyer. His professional survival instinct, momentarily stunned, reasserted itself. His eyes darted from the speaker to the thick, intimidating binder that Ben Carter had placed on the table before him. With a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, he reached out and pulled the binder closer. He opened it to the first page, the cover sheet Ben had so carefully drafted, which detailed the inventory of evidence within. the notarized transcripts, the chronological log, the referenced audio files. I watched him read, and I saw the last vestiges of his professional composure crumble. He was not just a lawyer witnessing a family dispute. He was an officer of the court looking at a meticulously documented criminal conspiracy that he had been, however unwittingly, a party to. He did not read any further. He snapped the binder shut, the sound a sharp, angry crack in the dead silence. He then began to gather his own papers, the power of attorney, the transfer agreements, with a frantic, almost violent energy. He stuffed them haphazardly into his briefcase, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He did not look at my children. He looked at Ben, and then at me, and his face was a mixture of pure, unadulterated terror and professional fury. He stood so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He gave Leo and Cynthia a look of such profound and undisguised contempt that it was more damning than any spoken verdict. Then he turned and walked, almost ran from the room. We heard the front door open and then slam shut with a sound of utter, panicked finality. He had abandoned his clients, a captain leaping from a sinking ship. His departure left my children alone, exposed, and defenseless in the wreckage of their own making. Leo was the first to move. The shock on his face slowly began to curdle into a dark, impotent rage. His hands, which had been flat on the table, clenched into two white-knuckled fists. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new and terrible understanding. The vague, deaf old man he had so easily dismissed was gone, replaced by the architect of his own destruction. There was no pity in his eyes now, only a raw, burning hatred, the hatred of a predator who has just discovered that the prey it was stalking was, in fact, the hunter. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to rage, to protest, but no sound came out. What could he say? We had a perfect, high-fidelity recording of his soul. Cynthia, on the other hand, simply collapsed inward. The color did not return to her face. She seemed to shrink in her chair, all the artifice, all the bright, brittle confidence, dissolving into a small, pitiable heap of shame. Silent tears began to stream down her face, not the performative crocodile tears I had seen her produce before, but the ugly, ragged tears of genuine, soul-crushing humiliation. She did not look at me. She could not. She stared down at the polished surface of the table, at the reflection of a woman she no longer recognized. The entire, carefully constructed edifice of her life, her social standing, her self-perception as a caring, competent daughter, had been leveled in the space of 15 minutes. Ben and I remained silent. We were the judges in this quiet, terrible tribunal, and our silence was the verdict. I looked at my children, at these two strangers who had grown up in my house, and I felt no triumph. I felt no satisfaction. I felt only a profound and weary sadness, the grief of a creator looking upon his own flawed and broken work. I had given them every advantage, every comfort, and they had used it to cultivate a rot in their own characters so deep that they had become capable of this. Finally, the silence was broken by a single, wretched sob from Cynthia. It was a sound that seemed to catalyze Leo. He stood, his chair grating against the floor, and pulled his sister, who seemed barely able to stand, to her feet. He did not look at me as he led her from the room. They stumbled out, two broken figures fleeing the scene of their own public execution. The front door opened and closed once more. I heard the sound of their car starting, the engine roaring with a desperate, angry sound, and then the squeal of tires as they sped away down my quiet, peaceful street. Ben and I were left alone in the silent dining room, the empty chairs a testament to the family that had just been irrevocably destroyed. He calmly gathered his papers, closed his briefcase, and stood. He walked over to me and placed a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken solidarity. Then he too was gone, leaving me alone in the aftermath. I walked to the table and looked at the pristine, useless legal documents they had left behind. I picked them up, the papers feeling thin and flimsy in my hand. I carried them to the living room and dropped them into the cold, dark hearth of the fireplace. I did not burn them. I just left them there, a final, silent artifact of a war that was finally, truly, over. The days that followed the final disastrous family meeting bled into weeks, and the house slowly, gradually, learned to breathe again. The violent, ugly silence of the confrontation was replaced by a quiet that was, at first, hollow and vast. But as the seasons began their slow, indifferent turn, as the last of the autumn leaves fell and the first hard frost silvered the lawn, the silence began to change. It lost its sharp, painful edges. It softened. It became not an absence of my children, but a presence of peace. The war was over. The enemy had been routed, and I, the sole victorious occupant of the battlefield, was left to the slow and solitary work of reclamation. I no longer performed my deafness. There was no one left to deceive. I took the clumsy, old-fashioned hearing aid from my bedside table and placed it in a drawer, among other obsolete artifacts of a past I no longer needed. I turned the television down to a comfortable, civilized volume. I began to reacquaint myself with the natural, unamplified soundscape of my own home. I learned again to live with the sounds I could hear, and to make peace with the ones I could not. The high-frequency whisper of the wind in the eaves was lost to me now, but the low, resonant groan of the old house, settling in the cold, was a deep and comforting companion. My life settled into a new, quiet rhythm. I would spend my mornings in the garden, preparing it for the coming winter, my hands in the cold, dark soil. I would spend my afternoons reading in my armchair, the newspaper no longer a prop or a shield, but a simple source of information about a world that now seemed very distant. Ben would visit once a week, and we would play our long, silent games of chess, the only sound the soft click of the wooden pieces on the board. He never spoke of my children, and I never asked. We were two old soldiers who understood that some victories are too costly to celebrate. Finally, when I felt that the last echoes of the conflict had truly faded from the walls of the house, I knew it was time for the final act. One morning, I descended the stairs to my basement workshop for the last time. The room, which had been my command center, my archive, my entire world for months, now felt like a relic of a different life. The air was still and cool, the machinery silent. My first task was the tapes, the metal boxes containing the reels, the complete magnetic record of my children's conspiracy, sat on a shelf. I took them down, one by one. I did not listen to them. I had no desire to ever hear those voices again. I placed the first reel on the Studer deck, but instead of threading it for playback, I took a powerful industrial bulk tape eraser from a cabinet. It was a heavy humming device that generated a strong magnetic field. I switched it on, and with a slow, deliberate pass over the spinning reel, I wiped the tape clean. I watched as the neatly organized magnetic patterns that held their words, their greed, their betrayal, were randomized, scattered, and returned to a state of pure, meaningless static. I did this for every single tape, until all that remained was a collection of blank, silent reels. Next, I turned to the logbook. The thick, cloth-bound ledger sat on my workbench, a dense and heavy testament to the ugliest chapter of my life. I ran my hand over the cover. Its pages contained a perfect, unassailable truth, a truth that had saved me. It had served its purpose. I did not burn it. To destroy it would have felt like a denial of the history it contained. Instead, I wrapped it in a protective sheet of oilcloth, tied it securely with twine, and placed it in the very back of my large, fireproof safe. It was no longer an active case file. It was an artifact, an archived record of a war that had been won. My final act was the decommissioning of the system itself. I sat down at my large mixing console, its surface a familiar landscape of knobs, faders, and meters. Each channel on this board corresponded to a hidden ear in my house: the kitchen, the living room, the hallways, the porch. For months, this console had been my lifeline, my early warning system, my tool for survival. I looked at the bank of faders, all of them set to their monitoring positions. Then, slowly, one by one, I pulled them down. With each smooth descending motion, I was closing a channel, silencing a part of my amplified world. The kitchen fell silent, then the dining room, then the hall. When all the faders were at the bottom, I reached to the main power conditioner and I flipped the single red switch. The warm, gentle glow of the vacuum tubes in my pre-amplifiers faded to black. The small green power lights on the oscilloscopes blinked out. The system, my house's secret nervous system, was now completely and irrevocably offline. I sat for a long time in the deep, profound silence of the soundproofed room. It was a silence unlike any I had ever experienced. It was not the artificial monitored silence of my surveillance, but a true, absolute, and perfect quiet. I was alone with the sound of my own breathing, the beat of my own heart. I was, for the first time in a very long time, simply a man in a quiet room. I went back upstairs. The house felt different, softer. I could hear the floorboards creaking under my own weight. I could hear the distant, gentle sigh of the wind outside. I was hearing the world through my own ears again, with all their limitations and imperfections. And it was a profound relief. I sat in my armchair. I did not need my newspaper. I did not need my headphones. I simply sat, and I listened to the true silence. It was the sound of my life, reclaimed. It was the sound of peace.